Written all good, right? Background. world's biggest digital space conference this year, organized by SDNx and Helium Learning Labs. My name is Sakshi, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Space Development Nexus and your host for today. This year's theme, the role of space education and research in emerging nations, was adopted to put a spotlight on the space activities in emerging nations and empower them further. We expect that through this summit, the students and young space professionals can get guidance with their education and career. SDNx Foundation was established in the year 2013 with the purpose of making space accessible to everyone through its initiatives and educational projects supported by space research and development. Helium Learning Labs, who are our organizing partner, are an edtech company that aims to establish a world-class digital space school to fill the gap between space education and the space industry to train students for the future space workforce. Now, moving on to introducing our lovely speaker for today, Mr. Antonio Falstag is an international space policy consultant currently based out of South Korea. He works as the Asia Pacific Regional Partnership Manager for Space Generation Advisory Council and is also represented in other Globe Space Network, including World Space Week Association, Moon Village Association, Conrad Foundation, and the National Space Society, among others. He participated in expeditions to the Arctic Sea and the Himalayan mountain ranges and is passionate about topics of sustainable development, deep tech, and international diplomacy. Today, he is going to talk about space policy and development across the Asia Pacific, from the role of governance to regulatory regimes to startups in space exploration. We are so glad and honored to have you, Mr. Antonio, today. Do you want to go ahead and start with your presentation? The stage is all yours.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sakshi. Very glad to be here. This is a very impressive conference. I've personally seen the SDNx network develop over the years, and following the huge and impressive development and expansion over the years, I'm very happy to be here. Gonna start sharing my screen so that you can see my slides. And there we go. Can you see it? Wonderful, thank you. So again, I'm an international business developer and a space policy consultant based out of South Korea. I have a lot of different involvements in numerous space-related groups. If you want to connect to me, you can find my LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter handles. That'll come up again in our Q&A session, so we can go ahead. So my topic for you today is called space policy. I believe in the previous session, you've had many other speakers come in and talk about space education, space technology, different aspects of space technology, businesses. The space industry has blossomed and expanded so much in the previous decade. Space industry has had a long line of development coming from the Cold War era, between the Soviet Union and the United States. And ever since, with this great expansion, with more nations and more entities being involved in space, the topic of space policy was previously very much in the sidelines because you only had so many entities involved. But now with the numerous, like hundreds and thousands of entities involved, space policy is becoming a hotly debated topic. Some of you might already be very much involved in space policy. For others, this may be a completely new discipline for you, and this might be the first time where you hear the word space and policy come together. So I'm just going to take you on a little tour of what this field is, what are the topics we cover, and what's the role of the Asia Pacific region in the whole thing. So what is space policy? There's so many different things that space policy go into, but three major regions that we go into is the topic of ownership, the topic of management, and the topic of exploration. Of course, there are numerous other topics in space policy apart from these, but like just for the sake of introduction and to get your interest, if you talk about ownership, there is the thing about orbits. You have so many satellites up there, satellites for communication, satellites for Earth observation, satellites for like geolocation and global positioning systems. All these happen in Earth orbit. There are so many different types of Earth orbit: low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, high Earth orbit, geosynchronous, whatnot. All these orbits have a place. Space is large. Many people, when they think of space, they're like, space is huge. Earth is just a small dot. Why do I have to fight over this vast space? We might think that, but it's also the same thing as an ocean. Like you have a vastness of an ocean, but only so much of ocean can actually be is actually useful or approachable, or it has a certain condition that allows mankind to really cultivate. And that's the same thing as orbits. While we have a lot of space out there, certain orbits are highly congested. They're very attractive to certain people, certain governments, certain parties. That's why we have a lot of conflicts on who gets to operate in which orbit. That's why we have a lot of different topics coming up in the topics of orbits. We also have the ownership of resources. When you go to the moon and pick up a rock, does that become yours? Are you allowed to keep it? Are you allowed to bring it back to space, bring it back to Earth? Are you allowed to sell it to other people? Can you dictate a price? Can you have, if you can you say that you own a certain part of land in space? Can you build a house on it? These are all topics that is within the realms of space policy and is heavily influential for many governments and companies when they want to do space exploration. Another thing is for a whole ownership is the topic of entities. What entities are recognized in space? Is private property a thing in space? Is a company, a nonprofit, a government agency, an entity that can be recognized in space? And if so, what is the stake of their ownership? If we fly something into space, is that company's? Most people would say yes. But if you build something in space, is that yours? Most people will still say yes. But if you start saying, if I take a lunar resource and convert it, process it, and then make something out of it, is that still yours? Because you've technically used something that is not yours. If you power yourself using solar power, is that yours? Because solar power seems to be free. But if your taking of solar power kind of goes over someone else's solar power, then is that right? Is that legal? All these entities are in the process of legal jurisdiction and definition, and is the backbone of what space policy is founded on. And then we have the whole thing of management. We have different laws and regulations on who gets to regulate what activities in space, what laws are applicable to space, what entities are there to enforce it, or are there enforcement recognized in the realm of space. Some of you who are heavily involved in space might recognize these acronyms of SSA and SDM. They're the abbreviations for Space Situational Awareness and Space Traffic Management. Space situational awareness basically means that you have an awareness of what activities is going over in space. It might be over your airspace, over your geographic area. It can be over different places. Like you could extend your SSA to the moon or Mars, just in the fact that you know what is out there, what is happening, what type of activities are going on. There are many different ways to do SSA. But it always goes into management of what entities are there, how much awareness you have, and how much enforcements or reinforcement you can have over the entities that's over there. Space traffic management is a similar thing. When you have different spacecraft, satellites, or manned spacecraft, or space stations in space, do you have a role in managing? Can they be actively maneuvered, or can they be passively maneuvered? If they and this goes into the field of space debris. If you have something in space and it is not maneuverable by itself, do you have a way to move it somewhere else? Do you have the rights to that? If it's owned by someone else, can you move that space debris somewhere else, or is it an infringement of their rights because you don't own that particular thing? This is all in the realms of management. And then there's a thing of exploration. You might know a thing called planetary protection. Planetary protection means that you're protecting an extraterrestrial body. Means that if you're trying to explore the moon or Mars, you have to be careful to not contaminate it with any viruses or diseases that might potentially come up from Earth, because we're still not sure if there is life on other planets or other space entities. If there's life on Mars, we don't want to kill it off by introducing germs from Earth, which is why planetary protection in space exploration is hugely important. And when we had a crash on the moon that carried what's usually called water bears onto the moon, most people were worried on would these organisms might contaminate the previously clean lunar environment. There's also the term of human heritage in manned spaceflight. We already have remnants of Apollo missions on the moon. Should they be protected? Like, how should we kind of protect that heritage when we do our exploration? How much of human heritage should be recognized, and how much can we actually build upon? When we do manned spaceflight in space exploration, do we have do you have a requirement to respect other manned spaceflight? Most of you have already seen The Martian, when we had Martian actual NASA astronauts being stranded on on Mars. Does that mean that other nations on Mars have a legal requirement to go rescue them? Because that is how it is in current maritime regulations. If you hear an SOS, then every ship and vessel in the vicinity is somewhat required to go over there and help, regardless of what other activities that they're doing. Is that the kind of requirements that can be expanded into space exploration? And then there's a whole thing about sustainability. How do we ensure that space exploration can be done in a sustainable environment, that we allow new entrants to space to have a part of space to explore, that we don't have all these developed nations go there and they just claim they carve out different Martian fields, they carve out moon, and then later entrants don't have anything to explore. So these is all the area of space policy, and what makes my life very interesting as a space policy consultant. And then we have so many other, and the thing is, all these things are interconnected. When you talk about orbits, space orbits, they go into space situational awareness and space traffic management. There's regulations and laws that has to be developed for humans' heritage and manned spaceflight. Maybe we need space traffic management that goes in with space sustainability. Space debris goes along with orbital mechanics and orbital management. These are all interlocking components that is not isolated by themselves, which is why space policy, being a new field, requires a lot of interdisciplinary thinkers and cross-cultural pollination. And then we have like a bunch of new topics that I did not mention. How do we introduce new technology? How do we verify new technology and allow their inclusion into space? Can space be militarized? Quite a few countries with the United States in front is trying to get a space force out there or the equivalent. Are weapons in space allowed? Can space be weaponized? Can we have satellites that have like military capabilities in targeting and striking Earth? Can we have anti-satellite capabilities on striking down targets that is up in space? Can we colonize Mars? Can we terraform Mars? We had the whole thing about planetary protection and not contaminating Mars, but we also have other people who say we must introduce new forests and new vegetation for Mars, terraform Mars, so that it can be a new habitat for human beings. Elon Musk memes sometimes becomes an area of space policy. His tweets are actually pretty influential sometimes. So there's so many other areas of space policy that you can be interested in. If you're a new person coming to the space field, you're very excited about technology and innovation and rocketry, but not sure if that's the role that you want to take, you can definitely take a look at space policy and see if this is something that you might want to do in the future, because we have a lot out here. We are very understaffed. We would very much like to have more and new people come into this field and develop these policies with us. So that's an introduction of space policy. Now let's kind of talk about what space policy actually entails. So previously, the regime we'd had back in the Cold War era, when we had the space race, the governments were the primary entities in the realm of space, and the private entities were a small part of it. Then we started to have private sector growing more. They have more say in how the industry is going. The government started shrinking. Like their budget, like NASA's budget isn't as big as it's actually big per the dollar, but it's taking up less percentage of what the national budget of US government is becoming. And nowadays you're seeing SpaceX, you're seeing Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, United Launch Alliance, Lockheed Martin Space, Boeing Space, and Thales Alenia, all these humongous multinational companies in the space arena that is kind of eclipsing the government. Government is doing more to follow on to the technological and market development that is happening in space. So space policy has adapted from these changing regimes of governance. Specifically, in terms of the role, in terms of the regimes, previously, more in the 20th century, it had a government-to-government regime. Government talked to each other, like the Russians talked to the Americans talked to Japanese. We had a very government-centric model, and then with the private parties becoming much bigger, we start to have what we call PPP, private-public partnership, where private companies were more at a level with public, and they had as much say in how policies were dictated to the government. Like government would do some degree of strategy, some degree of like outlining and direction, but the private parties would also hand like this is the type of innovation and technology that they want. And nowadays we have more market-centric regime where private partners are the leaders. They are the ones developing technology. They're the ones doing technologies that government couldn't think of, and governments are having a hard time catching up to the technology that's being developed out of Silicon Valley, out of South California, and for every other technological and space hubs in the world. So that's the difference in regimes that's coming up. And how does this affect how policy is being done? In the government-to-government regime, we have international treaties. Some of you might already be familiar with the Outer Space Treaty, and for the 5 international treaties in space. In that time, what the private parties did was that they were just contractors to the government. The governments were the one who dictated this is the priority. When the government said that we will go to the moon and in this decade and do the other things in a later date, all private parties did is that they just like became the contractors and developed the technologies that the government required. When we had the more public-private partnerships, the government would start developing laws and they would have policies. They would ratify the different treaties out there. And then the private party would develop the technologies required while also doing some technologies over there. You see in that Venn diagram, we have some overlap between the government and private, but also there's some technologies that's being developed that is outside of the government scope. And then with the private party becoming so huge, what the government is doing is more strategy and regulation. So this is very different from law and policy. Regulation is more in terms of the management. Like we have different agencies that are responsible. Like policy is purely in the legislative body. Regulation is more in the executive. They are the ones who's actually doing all the dealing with different parties and entities, trying to catch up with what the companies are doing. And the private companies, they're the ones who's creating new. Grandparents did not have college education. They didn't even have high school education. Most of the young generation in the Asia Pacific have a bachelor's degree or higher, which is a drastic difference for the human resources that we get to tap into. Our governments are also very young. Like some of us have some of the governments haven't had more than a few decades in developing compared to some other countries. A lot of our constitutions are new. A lot of our infrastructures and agencies are malleable to change. And lastly, we have a lot of diversity that is very unique to the region. Of course, Europe has its own diversity, Africa has its own diversity, South America has its own diversity. We cannot ignore that. But the Asia Pacific has its own cultural diversity that we can actually provide to the whole space regime. A lot of our blockbuster movies that have space, like Interstellar, Martian, they're all Western. Nowadays, we're seeing more and more of Asia Pacific influence in pop culture and how space is developed. So how can we actually develop it? What are the different benefits that we have? For the economic powerhouse, as I said, we have a lot of finance, we have a lot of money. We get to invest it in a new space infrastructure. With this money, we get to dilute a lot of risk. A lot of space takes a lot of risk. A lot of you have seen that how many rockets SpaceX had to blow up until he started getting the Falcon boosters back on Earth intact. All that needs a lot of investment, and with our own finances, we get to innovate in frontier technologies rather than to just catch up to already developed technologies where risk is mitigated. With our global manufacturing hubs, we can develop a lot of our hardware at a very low cost at a large scale. That is what Asia Pacific is known for. We can, as soon as we develop a technology, we can scale that in amazing scale in a very short time. You've seen the innovation that we've done in China. You've seen the innovation that's done in India. The Jigad mindset is crucial in expanding very fast, rapid prototyping to an entire market, and then expanding it to different regions and different parts of the world. Our highly educated population allow us to take a lot of different leaps and cross-pollination of ideas across different sectors. We can take medicine and go and then have it with space and merge the two together to have space medicine. We have different VR and AR technologies that goes well with like high advanced communication that can be communication tools that can be used for intraplanetary and interplanetary communication. A lot of observation equipment are created, like most of the high-end observation equipment is made in the Asia Pacific. We can use that and merge that with different fields. Also, what that means is that for a lot of the outreach and education that we're doing here in the Asia Pacific, they have a huge following. The reason that NASA was so successful in becoming the world leader is that they had an amazing marketing strategy and public outreach in making space cool. When you think before, prior NASA, space was like, nerdy. Engineers was like shabby shirts, people who ate pizza and Coke. Now, after NASA, it became a cool thing. When you're NASA engineers, it was a hype thing to be. And the same thing is happening in China and India. When you're becoming a rocket engineer, when you're becoming a propulsion engineer, when you're becoming a systems management, people look up to you. It's becoming the new thing. And with new media coming on, with TikTok and Instagram, with new media lines, whatever you're doing, things like this, these new webinars and online sessions, new influencers, they have a huge impact to be made in Asia Pacific more than any other region in the world. Lastly, for the young, and second to last, for the young governments, because we're so new, it's very easy for us to adopt new regulatory regime. There's less of a hurdle to go over because we have less to kind of tear apart and build new. We can create new ministries. We can create new agencies that is dedicated to space. There is no distribution of different aspects of the space industry that was like in different ministries and agencies. We can just create a new thing and consolidate it in a speed that is so much faster than any other regimes. We can integrate technology into our policies that is simply impossible for other countries. When you see all the rail networks being laid out in China, when you see the new introduction of technology for government communication in India, you see the speed by which they are being implemented. That is impossible because in the Western world, they've been doing it in another way for decades. We don't have to recreate that. We can just go and create it with our young governments. And lastly, for cultural diversity, a lot of the Western thinking, a lot of our current regime that is being done in space is very much Western, is very much centered in democratic parliamentary ways. Not many, while a lot of countries in Asia Pacific are still democratic, some countries are not democratic. Some countries don't have that many parties, and that introduces a new line of perspective on how space can be explored. And how like different regulatory regimes can be established in space. These are all new ideas that allows other entrants, new entrants previously barred from the space race to contribute to space. As soon as Asia Pacific gets in there and we have a voice in the global space sector, we are paving the way for future countries to come in and explore space side by side with us. And lastly, and that's kind of like the role of Asia Pacific plays in the whole space sector. So how do we kind of strategize for the future of space development? What can we do? Like, what is the value of forums like this, like the Space Development Nexus, and for the Global Space Summit? One is that we can engage in interdisciplinary studies. Like myself, this space policy is a cross-disciplinary of space engineering and international policy and law. It's the combination of those two fields that allow the space policy to exist. And in the future, you will see so many other of those, like which kind of like the future development, future space development will be founded in these interdisciplinary studies. Space architecture, space engineering, hazardous environment with architecture that is both art and system design. Space tourism is both a business and engineering, space governance, space art. These are all things that's being newly developed, but is growing at a rapid pace. A lot of you know the Dear Moon project, where you can actually go to the moon just by being an artist. a lot of influencers that are taking zero-G flights and doing experiments in space that were previously unopened for influencers. Like the whole influencer was not a thing. These are future developments. Hone in on them. Like open your minds and ensure that you can get into those fields whenever they open up. So maintain agility because you will have to pivot so many times in this future place. Make sure that you have resilience because a lot of these fields, when they're opening up, will go into a lot of roadblocks. People thought space tourism is gonna be big, and we had so many other space tourism companies. You already know Blue Origin. You already know Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, but there's been other companies like X-Core Technologies, and other companies that wanted to do space tourism, but they went bankrupt or they had to be assimilated into other companies. Like the whole Virgin Galactic used to be Scale Composite, and only afterward they acquired by Virgin and had an infusion of extra finance were they able to continue on with whatever that they were doing. So you need to be prepared that these technology will come in jumps, but after those jumps, you will come into bureaucratic bottlenecks. You will be stopped. You will have different regulatory hurdles that you will have to go through, and that is when you will need resilience. And then you have to have a dynamic view of the future because you previously had you might have wanted to focus in, well, perhaps an Australian space market, and suddenly you have to pivot to a different space market because suddenly regulatory regimes change, governments change, administrations change, and perhaps the market is not as good as you thought it was going to be. So that dynamic market is something that as smaller players in the field, you have to be concerned with. So that's kind of like my story for the future, and I can now be open for question. I think I hit that 30 minutes mark.
Exactly. It is like just exact 6 p.m. So, perfect. I think I loved, your insights on space policy and whatever is Asia Pacific doing and how can we be, progressing in the space industry. My first question with you is related to that, sort of collaboration between developed nations, spacefaring nations and emerging nations in Asia Pacific as well. Because as you mentioned that, countries like India and then China, they are good with low cost slash manufacturing, right? And with a country like the United States, where we have NASA, they're good with outreach and marketing. So how do you think this kind of collaboration can benefit us all, right, in the emerging nations especially?
So the great thing about existing spacefaring nations is that they have a tried and developed way of exploring space. So they've already developed the wheel, and for a lot of things that we're doing right now, we do not need to reinvent the wheel. We know what happens, we know what works, and sometimes you have for if you go into rocket boosters, if you have a payload that simply cannot be messed up. If you have, for example, if you have a James Webb telescope, maybe you don't want that in a rocket that might potentially explode. You want that to go on a rocket system that has been tested and validated and has over a few dozen successful launches consecutively without any failures, because you can't afford to make that payload once again. For manned spaceflight, you cannot replace human beings. So you want something that's run and tested. So in those places, technology transfer from existing spacefaring nations to developing nations might come in handy. On the other side of things, new spacefaring, new incoming nations might have an advantage over spacefaring nations because they are more agile. They can develop new things. If you look at countries like Luxembourg, they're developing new finance structure and new legal regimes that recognize private ownership of space entities that's allowing new space businesses to flock to this small European country, because whatever space they do there, their ownership in space will be recognized by Luxembourg law, and that is a huge advantage that they have. And this is something that many other countries in the Asia Pacific can also emulate. We do not have to become the next NASA. We do not have to become the next Silicon Valley. We can have our own method of going into space. India has had unsuccessful launches. We have had unsuccessful lunar missions. Same has been for China as well. They've also had failures. But the thing is, we are not as risk adverse as developed countries, because when when the United States were doing a national lunar mission, they could not afford to fail. For India and China, they could afford to fail a bit more because it's something that has been done before, and we're trying to go for like not radically new, but to test out new platforms and to see where things could go. So these are things that we as emerging nations can offer, and there's a lot of partnerships that can go in. Sometimes emerging existing countries are not willing to take on certain risk or want to risk their own national pride in a certain project, and those are the projects that emerging countries can take on, and that is where countries can really come together. If you look at the Artemis Accords, the signatories of Artemis Accords aren't just existing nations. You have the United Arab Emirates, you have New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, which are to a certain part new countries coming into the space field where they don't have space agencies, or their space agencies were created just in the last like 3-4 years. This is a kind of collaboration that we can look forward in the future.
Definitely. And, as you were talking about, outreach, and also just how we are introducing like new media companies, and there's like a cultural shift that has been happening, especially this year. There were like so many exciting projects that were, coming up in the space industry. So, how do you think the space industry would look like in next 10 years? And do you think like just because we are too excited to go to Mars, we're ignoring, issues like space debris or, climate change?
Right. And that's a great thing about space. There are a lot of actors out there who are concerned about sustainability. There's a lot of activity being out there on space debris removal. A lot of new companies that's doing that. Astroscale, iSpace, just to name a few companies that are interested in ensuring that space can be open for other countries. At the same time, we do have to be mindful that while we are trying to ensure sustainability, we don't block the path for new entrants to come into space. The existing spacefaring nations have had a lot of opportunities to just to deploy as many satellites as they want into orbit, and it was still fine. Like we had so much space, the orbit was open. Nowadays, we can't afford to do that. New satellites, when you want to go up there, they have to be registered in international regime. I mean, it's not required, but it is very much recommended that you do so. They have to have a certain radar cross section so that they can be tracked using ground system. They have to be, when you go up there, they have to have an expected life expectancy so that you can ensure that after that, people can kind of like bring them back down. When you want to launch something, before you could have just launched something. Nowadays, a lot of launch providers require you to have insurance policies, and their launch costs would become prohibitively high if you cannot prove that your launch is insured and they don't have to like take on so much risk. There's a lot of new regulatory and new obstacles that are disqualifying new entrants from coming into the regime. As long as we can take advantage of those things and not be so set back, and we ensure that whatever regimes and whatever new regulatories we have to have a common understanding of these new actors, then we can go into. And at the same time, we want to leave the space open for new types of incoming. As you said, new influencers on Instagram and TikTok are coming into the whole space arena. These new platforms and venues such as the GSS is becoming a new sector where people outside of the traditional government and military can come in and discuss things about how can space be explored. They have to be fostered in. Like we can develop new outcomes, publish white papers from these talks, present them to governments and say, this is your constituents. This is the people that you want to talk to. These are the people who hold the money and has the votes to reject a new bill, to reject a new parliamentary announcement. This is the people that you want to hear to. More awareness among the citizens on the importance of space, on the importance of sustainability, on the topics like climate change will be, and incorporating that into new laws and regulations, it will be critical in the future of space.
Definitely. I think as being one of the science communicator, I understand the importance of it, not only like in the space sector, but also climate change. As David Attenborough said, that we need more science communicators, to tackle climate change and obviously, in the space sector. So, what kind of career options can people go for? As you said, space policy is sort of a mixture of space engineering and then policy. So like, what kind of other careers you look forward to, excited about in the future? I know there will be a time where we'll be looking forward to your diplomacy as well, because I hope so that we do not reach that point, but we may have division in space in terms of borders. So yeah.
Right, and that's a great part because you can start envisioning a career that you could want. A lot of space policy people out there and space lawyers, the term space lawyer didn't really exist in the space lexicon or were widely attributed until a few years ago. And a lot of the space policy experts that's working right now did not have a degree both in space and law. They're either like lawyers who came into space or space engineers who came into law. Sometimes they don't have expertise in either and just somehow came into this field. If you look at this militarization of space is a very big field, and a lot of people who's coming in are coming in from Navy, coming in from the Air Force. Space was a relatively new field, but we're trying to find a way on how we can incorporate existing methodologies and terms and systems into into the space regime. People who's been doing maritime law now coming into space because a lot of the common resources, the recognition of a global commons is somewhat similar and can be echoed in the space field. At the same time, there's also drastically new career options that you can have. You can be a space stewardess. Like now, airplanes have stewardess. We have entire schools that create airplane stewardess. You have to like have a degree in airport stewardess. Now with space, we are seeing the development of space planes. We're seeing the space tourism market opening up. Space stewardess could be a new career that you could take on. Something like a space hotel management is going to be a new thing with new space hotels opening up. We've had a new successful test of a hotel model that just happened a few weeks ago. These are new developments that can happen in space diplomats. This is where I would like to be. It's going to come up. Private astronauts, like astronauts who are contracted out and not government licensed and not government affiliated, is also a new option. Space artists can be a whole new degree of thing. Space athletes can be a new thing. If you like, you could make a career out of playing, who knows, space golf. These are new career options that you can definitely go into if you have an interest in how different fields, as I said, interdisciplinary, on how different fields can merge together and how they might be available and relevant to the space industry. Go ahead and do your research. Who knows, your dream might come true.
Definitely. I remember this interview with Gitika. She is a very young entrepreneur. She's only 17 years old. And she said that, when I searched, I wanted to do something in space sciences. And also, I was passionate about medicine. I literally Googled space and something that comes up, and it was like space medicine. So I'm definitely pretty sure that, in the future, we are going to have more fields in space where with what people can opt for. So, like, as you talked about, startups as well, like how can they sort of affect the whole governance as well, and how it can affect the policies as well, right? So in India, in last 2 years, I think there is the kind of revolution that has been going on in startups, right? There are a lot of known names like Agnikul, Pixel, and all of these relatively new startups, old startups, who are doing really good. So how do you think privatization and in space can support the development in emerging nations and in Asia Pacific, or any particular startups you are excited about and you look forward to?
Right. The great thing about private actors and the reason we have seen so much innovation in the space sector in the last like decade or so is the fact that a lot of private companies have become more involved in space. governments by definition are risk averse. They are using taxpayer money. They cannot really afford to lose money, or they cannot, whatever things that they do need to have benefit for the whole citizen, for the whole country. Private companies do not have the requirements. They could fail. They could go bankrupt. They could sometimes, like space tourism, they can serve a very specific elite clientele, and they have a lot of risk that they can take on as they are dealing with private money. And that's the role of private companies in space. That's also why a lot of developing nations coming into space are trying to make their own hubs for space companies, where they have like a certain geographic area where all these manufacturing, innovation, and R&D centers relevant to space are coming together, so that you foster innovation and cross-pollination of ideas, and it lowers the barrier for different models and different service components, and for common standards to be developed within the same country. So again, the companies are now taking a lead. The governments are more supporting. At the same time, the governments have to ensure that they are less of a roadblock and more of a supporter. Sometimes when you have regulations, military regulations, trade regulations, intellectual property regulation that affects space, that could become a bureaucratic bottleneck for innovation to happen. There could, like, not all investments is as free as you believe them to be. Sometimes different investments have to prove something. They have to have a certain turnover. Sometimes they need to have some amount of cash at hand in case of bankruptcy. Different banks have different rules depending on what country and what field you're going into, on how much of an interest rate they can charge or they should charge to a particular type of investment. There are different investment rating regimes. All these have to be controlled and have to come in synchronization with each other, so that whatever innovation wants to happen can happen more swiftly and agile. So whatever private sector activities happening there can really take advantage of the agility and the resilience of the private space sector, because too much regulation means that you're going to be bogged down, but also too little regulation means that companies don't have long-term expectancy on what their market could be in a few years if you don't have enough regulation. So you need to have that sweet spot of having too little regulation and too much regulation that supports the space industry in the private market.
Right, definitely. And I think just like looking at emerging nations, there's something that every speaker was talking about, especially the countries in Africa, that there are so many underlying issues that the government need to solve. In these countries, that it's really hard to think about even space education, right? Even they don't even talk about privatization or space startups. So like, how do you think what reformation is required in the educational structure in emerging nation to add space education as a priority, or like, is there something that can be done? I remember a session that I attended for International Space University, and I think one thing that was mentioned there was that it has been really difficult to reach out to the African nations in terms of just getting more students from that country and introducing scholarships as well. So like, what do you think that can be done here?
Right, so I have previously mentioned that education does have a huge role in space, and that is why we're seeing a lot of new developments happening out of Asia Pacific, because we have this very highly educated population that has just come into the workforce and is coming into the work stream. Education has both a private role and a public role. A lot of public curriculums can be written, public education curriculums can be written so that they have a more rigorous STEM field. Like, the whole STEM field is becoming more and more emphasized across the world. A lot of governments are saying that each countries or their curriculums or their school needs to be equipped with some kind of computer labs, investing more resources to the students so they know how to program at an earlier age, because programming and knowing how to be involved, to be integrated into the digital world, hugely affects the quality of your workforce in the 21st century. At the same time, higher education, which for a lot of countries is privatized, also has a role, because privatized education does have the ability to take on private funding. and that funding can be used for sponsorships and for building new labs, for investing in R&D. The great thing about academia is that not all finances has to be used for space applications. Although there's a lot of institutions out there, they're doing a lot of engineering, a lot of rocketry, a lot of new satellite deployment and whatnot. But at the same time, you can't leave out the value of pure science, of astronomy, of doing astrophysics or cosmology. These are fields that require applications in space, but by themselves is pure science. And the reason why the United States has had such a lead in the whole space application regime was because they had a very big regime in the whole pure space. The whole theme of ISS and the International Space Station is that they had a lot of biological experimentation that was being done in the ISS that simply cannot be done on Earth. And a lot of those experiments were pure sciences. A lot of data that were created in ISS did not have immediate technological application. And only after years after, with new change in fields, with new advances in medicine and whatnot, did people suddenly find out, oh my God, the things that we find out, all the new data that we had from the ISS is now becoming available, and that's what kickstarted the application. So ensuring that academia has both a focus in application and pure sciences, and funds are invested in both sides would be very important in the role of education. And also ensuring that whatever educational development that's being out there has area for cross-pollination. As I said, space is becoming more interdisciplinary than ever. If you have a school, a university where the engineering school, where the School of Engineering, the School of Business, the School of Hotel Management, all work in their own silos, they will not have space business. They will not have space hotel management. They have to constantly communicate with each other. There are also a lot of exchange programs going into other countries, looking at what their other countries are doing, what their regimes are, what their regulations are like. Just doing a lot of studies, webinars, and awareness of international agreements will be very important in the whole educational field, and ensuring that whatever you're doing in space, you can find your niche area for you to work on.
Definitely. I think yeah, that was for the general questions, and now I'm going to ask some fun questions to you, and then okay. So, what is your favorite science fiction movie? As we were talking about, some movies like yeah.
Oh wow, there's a lot. Actually, not a movie, but on Amazon, you can actually watch this thing, which this doc interplanetary civilization. We have the Earth, the United Earth Federation. People are like very somewhat aggressive, and you have the Belters, the people who live in the asteroid belt, and they have their own culture. It is very scientifically accurate. The philosophy and the culture that is depicted in The Expanse has so much scientific and research backing. Like, not too many people know this because it's only available on Amazon Prime. Probably was on Sci-Fi. If you have the opportunity to go watch it, definitely do. You would be amazed at the level of diplomacy, science, culture that is in that TV series about an interplanetary civilization. It really opens up your eyes on, like, wow, is this what we're gonna go to? Like, all this thing that we're talking about, oh, India and China kind of fighting each other, all that kind of like goes out the door when you see the Mars Congressional Republic trying to invade Earth and the lunar system becoming its own thing. It's a mind blower. Definitely go watch it.
Okay, I'm gonna do that after this session.
Oh,
I think most of this, yeah, right. Just go ahead.
And not a TV series, but also a book series. If you need book recommendations, read The Three Body Problem. This is by a Chinese author. It has English translation. I'm not sure if they have Hindi translation. I know it's been translated to a lot of different languages. Netflix is new TV series or movies that's gonna come out of it. It the three-body problem, I cannot provide it with enough compliments on the that it include as space law, as space policy, as a pure science, cosmology, astrophysics, dark matter, dark energy. It's a 3-book series. It's mind-blowing. Definitely go read it.
All right, thank you for the suggestion. I mean, a lot of speakers, they said their favorite movie was Interstellar, and that is pretty obvious. But yeah, this is the first time I'm hearing like the series and the book. So thank you for that. Also, like one more question I want to ask is like, what technology would you like to become a reality, like a sci-fi technology that would you like to become a reality in the future, and like something that's maybe scientists are working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, some people say like, like fusion energy and whatnot. For me, it's very simple. It's just one string. I just want a very good string. Some of you might already know what I'm trying to say. Space elevators. I really want space elevators to become a reality. It's the most efficient and economic way to bring things into orbit, to bring huge structures to build, to be built in orbit. There is a lot of technological problems in building space elevators, all the way from like what type of tether, what type of nanomaterials are you gonna use, to the whole field. Like we have so much space debris and satellites in orbit. If you want a tether that reaches geosynchronous orbit, aren't things gonna like clash into it, whatnot? But if all those technological obstacles and political and cultural also can be overcome, I really want to see space elevators, because from then on, you could go to space as if you're gonna take a very expensive train ticket, or maybe it's more like a cheap flight ticket. Space could become that approachable. We will, if space elevators become a thing, you are guaranteed that you will see a colony in orbit and on the moon.
This sort of seems like the Hitchhiker Guide to Galaxy. Like the idea of space elevators are just like moving from like one place to another in space. Fascinating. So I think we have one question from the audience. It's like, where do you see yourself in another 5 years in space policy, and like how do you think like it's gonna develop, in another 5 years or so?
I really want to be an astronaut, a private astronaut. I know quite a lot of you have this dream. I am still working on it, doing a lot of different fields of research and career choices based on the fact that I do want to become an astronaut. Hopefully, in 5 years, I will be an astronaut candidate, because government astronauts are very difficult to be done, but private astronauts are much easier to do. And with the development by SpaceX and a lot of different companies in new manned spaceflight technologies, I hope that the doors to become astronauts would be opened up more. Nowadays, you don't like the field. Before, if you wanted to be an astronaut, you had to have a PhD degree or higher. You had to be a Navy pilot, et cetera, et cetera. You had all these requirements that we don't need if you want to be a private astronaut. Like there are new opportunities, I can't tell you which ones, because there really hasn't been a private astronaut just yet. Just yet. I mean, Virgin Galactic, kind of like a private astronaut, but like not like actual stepping on the moon type of astronaut. So really hoping I get to be that. 5 years maybe not, but 10 years I hope so.
Definitely. Sorry, my internet connection is a bit unstable, but all right. I think that was it. That was, the end of the session. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Mr. Antonio. I'm pretty sure that I would like to know more about, space policy and get into the field. And I wish you good luck. I'm sure, like, I'm going to see you, maybe, posting that, oh, I am in this astronaut program, or something like that, in the near future. Thank you for joining us today. Our next sessions are tomorrow in the afternoon and then one in the evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.